Let's say you have a WordPress website and you want to extend its functionality. For example, you might want to create new users when something happens on the front end, or you want to dynamically fetch some posts or any data from the backend. This is a perfect use case for the REST API. Pretty much everything you can see in this dashboard, posts, media, pages, comments, users, and so on, can be accessed or modified with PHP. And REST API lets you kind of build a gate to access and modify this data. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create custom REST API endpoints, how to extract data and parameters from requests, and how to protect your endpoints. So what do you need to do this? Obviously, you're going to need a functioning WordPress website. I'm going to use this test website running in a Docker container. By the way, if you want to know how to create a WordPress development environment using Docker, check out this video on my channel. The link is in the description below. Next, you have to be able to add or modify PHP code. You can do that either in a theme or in a custom plugin. I'll use this custom theme to do that as an example. Now let me show you what exactly we're going to build. We want to be able to send a post request to our server. We want it to have some payload. We want the endpoint to be protected by a password, which is specified here in the authorization header. And when I call this endpoint, we wanted to create a new user in the WordPress dashboard. As you can see, if I call it with the same data, it says the user is already created, but I can specify another email and username, and another user gets created. By the way, if you find this video helpful, please consider subscribing to the channel. This helps a lot. Thank you so much. Alright, without further ado, let's dive into it. If you're in a theme, then you're going to need a file called functions.php. If you're in a plugin, you're going to need a file called index.php in the root of your plugin. I'm in a theme, so I'm going to open up this functions.php file, and I'm going to start by hooking into the REST API init action REST API init. What this does is it basically tells WordPress to call this function when this event happens, when WordPress initializes REST API. And we're gonna declare our endpoints here. To declare an endpoint, I'm gonna write register REST route. And the first argument here is the namespace. I'm going to call it my API v1 version 1. And then comes the name of the endpoint. I'm going to call it test. And here in the third argument, we need to define some additional parameters. I'm going to start with permission callback. What this does is it accepts the current requests. For now, I'm just going to return true, but I'm going to come back to that later. The next parameter is methods. For now, I'm going to go with get. And then we create our callback. This is the function that's going to be executed on the server. For now, I'm just going to return 42123 as a test and save it. Now if I go to my browser and go to localhost wp-json my API v1 test, as you can see, we get this output, which is exactly what we specified here. Now to use the post method, you just need to go here and instead of get, write post. And if I go back to my browser and refresh the page, as you can see, no route was found matching the URL, because now this is a post request, and what the browser does is it sends a GET request. So if we now want to test this endpoint, we need to go to some other API client. Here I'm using Postman, for example, and as you can see, here's our endpoint. We're going to send a post request, and if I hit send, we get exactly the same response. Alright, the next thing I want to do is I want to send some data from Postman to our server. For example, I want to send an email, a username, and a password. Of course, nothing happens right now because we don't actually do anything in this callback function. You can actually access this data very easily. First of all, we need to parse the body, the payload, request get body. This get body method returns the payload as a string, so we need to convert it to an object, JSON decode, and now I can output this object. Let's do it like this: body is body. And as you can see, we get the same data back from our server, which means that we can access this data on the server now. Now, to access each of these properties, we can simply use body email. Let's assign it to a variable. Email equals to body email. Username equals to body username. And the same thing for the password. Okay. And now we want to create a WordPress user with this data. There's a function for that called WP create user, which accepts the username. Let me check again. Right, username, password, and email. And this function either returns an error or the ID of the newly created user. So let's call it result. And here we're going to check if result instance of WP error, and we're going to return result. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and return the ID result like this. And if we now call this function, we get ID 16. And if I check the dashboard users, as you can see, a new user appears here with this email address, with this username, which means our API does work. Now, there's only one problem with that, which is everybody can access our API right now. If this would be a public server, then everybody could access the same endpoint and create an infinite number of users, which we obviously don't want. And to prevent that, we can protect our endpoint with a password, for example. And to do that, we can use this permission callback function. Here we can check the headers of our request, for example, like this: auth header equals to request get header authorization. If this header is undefined, we're going to return false. If it's defined, here we know that it's defined. We're going to compare it to our password. For example, if header is not equal to lorem ipsum, we return false. So here we basically check if the header is defined, and here we check if the header is our password specified here. If not, we return false, and this callback function doesn't get executed. Otherwise, we return true, which means we allow WordPress to execute this function and create a new user. So let's check it. If I try to call this endpoint now, as you can see, sorry, you're not allowed to do that. But once I specify the password, yeah, it says, sorry, the username already exists, which means WordPress does actually execute this callback. So if we remove authorization, it doesn't work because we're unauthorized. And if we add authorization, we can create new users and access this endpoint. ID 17, ID 18, and so on. And this is basically how you create custom API endpoints in WordPress. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.